A Gap in the Spectrum is Marilyn Duckworth's first novel, written in 1959 when she was 23 years old. It is a novel whose strange and quiet compulsiveness entitles it to a very long reading life. It was published by New Authors Limited, an imprint of Hutchinson's in London. It was republished in 1986 by Oxford University Press. The silent, brilliant whirlpool of imagination that this novel discovers makes it an outstanding addition to the New Authors list. A Gap in the Spectrum by Marilyn Duckworth, read by Sarah D.
Chapter 2. The clock had stopped and I had lost all idea of the time. Lying lazily on the bed, I looked at my crumpled skirt and jumper, the array of objects on the desktop, the trail of powder on the carpet. Gradually a feeling of disgust crawled into my mind, and suddenly I sat up. For heaven's sake, the place was in a mess, and I'd always had such a reputation for tidiness. Of course, I wasn't me now, or at least I refused to think about it, but instead began to wonder where I could have a bath. The house was silent, as it had been yesterday, and when I opened my door, there was no one in sight. I had not yet explored the narrow corridor to my right. In doing so, I found what I had been looking for. The bathroom was cold and smutty, but there was a trickle of warm water in the hot tap. I washed thoroughly and began to feel better. Back in my room, I surveyed the coat hangers in my wardrobe doubtfully. There was not much choice. Another skirt, 2 jumpers, and a taffeta frock. I changed my skirt and began to put up my hair in a ponytail, but it looked rather silly, so I tied the ribbon flat on the nape of my neck, as I usually did. Then I started methodically to tidy the room. It was a slow job, because I kept coming across new clues to my identity in this world. My first find was a photograph album. I opened it with a curious feeling of trespassing. Well, there I was, accompanied by strangers, at dances, in the street, on the beach. The photos didn't seem in character with myself at all. They gave the impression that I spent most of my time enjoying myself, and I felt a strange pang of envy that I could remember none of this. Most of the snapshots had names and dates alongside, and I stared intently at the recurring face of Robert. He was pale, with straight dark hair and a wide grin which gave him a faintly elfish look. He seemed interesting, but struck no responsive note in me. I went on tidying reluctantly until I was happily sidetracked by a big brown envelope bulging with air letters from New Zealand. They were mostly from Robert, written in a minute scrawl that was painful to decipher. I persevered for some time until I had reached the conclusion that he talked mostly about himself, with I love yous interspersed at tactful intervals. They contained few clues about myself, so I dived deeper into the envelope. There were several letters from a Barry Morrison, who seemed on surprisingly intimate terms with me, and poured out the pornographic details of his love affairs without inhibitions. I was at once shocked and amused, and wondered what our relationship could possibly have been. Then I remembered Robert had mentioned a Barry in his last letter. Yes, there it was. Does Barry write to you? Because I'm not jealous anymore. Then there had been something between us, though there was no mention of it in Barry's letters. The remaining letters were from Mummy, and I noted this fact with mixed feelings. She could hardly be the mother I had left behind me in my old land. Besides, I had never called her Mummy. And surely she would notice the change in me, my lack of reaction in certain things. The feeling of panic began to flood back again, and I quickly tried to reason with myself. After all, Robert had described London as oceans away from New Zealand, so I probably wouldn't be seeing her for some time. I opened the letter more calmly, but soon discovered that she was writing not from New Zealand, but from a place called America, where she seemed to be holidaying with my father. She mentioned coming to England, but didn't state when. I've picked up some nice things for your trousseau over here, but we'll have to go shopping together in London for your wedding dress, she went on. I didn't know what trousseau meant. We had no word for it, but the mention of a wedding dress confirmed my suspicions that I was engaged to Robert. This didn't worry me unduly. I would break it off after a feasible length of time. I reflected suddenly that I would not have come to this decision so casually had I been back in Macauld, surrounded by my family. Perhaps I was losing my sense of responsibility. With this thought, I closed the envelope briskly and stacked it away on the desk. At least I would retain my tidy habits. By this time, I had a pile of old newspapers, paper bags, and other rubbish accumulated in the middle of the floor. There was no waste paper basket, although stuffed down the side of the desk were 2 big carrier bags, labelled Marks and Spencer, overflowing with damp-smelling waste paper. I considered for a moment how to dispose of this and the other rubbish. Then I remembered that I had noticed a rubbish bin in the little courtyard out of my window. It was a question of finding my way down there. With a carrier bag squashed under each arm, I passed the bathroom on my way to the little dark stairs. They descended in a dusty spiral, and I found myself in a passageway opposite the open door of what appeared to be a kitchen. It was bare except for a scrubbed wooden table, a grubby gas stove, a kettle, and a box of matches. I could hear a radio going in the next room. There was a broken skylight at the end of the kitchen, and remembering this landmark from the view out of my window, I moved across to the outside door and found myself in the courtyard. I was coming back into the kitchen when I heard voices. The woman in black, who I had decided was the housekeeper, came in. She was followed by a very tall, extremely thin girl in a blue housecoat who was saying, "Be an angel, Mrs. Reed, and get me something to eat. Just toast and butter or anything. I haven't had a bite since breakfast yesterday. Couldn't get out of bed." She certainly looked ill, with dark smears under her eyes, and since she was the first fellow inhabitant I had seen, I stared at her with interest. Neither of them had appeared to notice me, and I suddenly had the odd sensation that they couldn't see me. So rather loudly I said, "Hello!" Mrs. Reed jumped, and I with her, and then she added, "Hello, dear. Getting your cup of coffee?" "Well, yes," I sighed with relief. "I suppose I could," and ran upstairs for the coffee tin and blue beaker. While I drank my coffee, I listened to a little radio which I had discovered on the floor by the cupboard. I was waiting to find out the time. The programs seemed disappointingly like the ones I had been used to, except for a slight difference of accent. At any moment I expected them to announce, "This is Z-Line 66," but instead the voice suddenly informed me, "This is the BBC Light programme, and the time is 10 o'clock." I was pleased to find that I must have woken at quite a reasonable hour. I had been beginning to think that the change in atmosphere had upset my metabolism, so that I spent more than half my time sleeping. I set the clock, at the same time resolving not to go to bed till 10, my usual bedtime. Having arranged my day in this much of a pattern, I sat back on my heels and gave a sigh, almost of contentment. I noticed how hungry I was, famished. Just supposing I went down to Mrs. Reed and said casually, "Be an angel and get me something to eat." I gave a small snort of laughter, then was serious again, thinking about the problem of money. Suddenly a thought struck me. Perhaps I had a job, and was expected there at this very moment. Perhaps it was payday. My eyes fluttered swiftly round, searching for a clue. Robert had asked, "When are you going to get a job?" But I could possibly have acquired one since I last wrote to him. How in the world could I find out? Maybe my pockets would hold a clue, a bus ticket, a wage receipt. I opened the wardrobe door and began to hunt, not very hopefully. Almost at once I came across a rolled-up beret, and out of it fell a wad of notes in a rubber band. Relief leaped up in me as I stooped to count them, 9 in all, enough to last me till I had a job. If I had one already, I could now ignore it, but I was beginning to dismiss the idea as improbable. A wave of faintness came over me, and I remembered how hungry I was. I didn't bother to board a bus, but found a Lyons cafeteria in Sloane Square. With 2 bread rolls and a bar of chocolate, I made my way to a table. It wasn't quite so cold as it had been, but the pavements were still snow-covered, and for a few minutes I couldn't take my mind off the numbness of my feet. Gradually I began to catch a little of the warmth of the people around me. All the time I was noticing the recurrence of this colour, red. There seemed to be such a lot of it. It appeared to reflect in people's faces and give them a sort of positive glow. I had bought a paper on my way in and now looked at it. At home, I had never bothered much about reading the news, glancing only briefly at the theatre column in Woman's page, so was singularly ignorant in world affairs. For the first time, I thought of this as an advantage. Now I could begin afresh, without having my brain cluttered with incorrect data. This paper looked, at first glance, much the same as our ones at home, except for the blacker and more startling headlines. As I read on, I felt a disbelieving horror growing on me. Sex crimes, murder, divorce. I couldn't believe that so much had been happening, all at about the same time. The thought that tomorrow's newspaper would be as bad made me go cold. I glanced around timidly, trying to imagine these people involved in such crimes. They were eating placidly, reading their newspapers with calm, indifferent interest. I looked back at my folded page. I couldn't understand what could provoke people to do such things, unless they were all a little mad. I wished I was back at home. I had finished eating, but was reluctant now to leave the warmth of the shop, so remained huddled in my chair, studying the situations vacant with little enthusiasm. Things had become unreal again, and I was thinking, hopefully, that I would wake up at any minute. The place was filling up, and a woman approached my table doubtfully with a laden tray. I got up and left. A bus was passing as I looked up, and the red glow suddenly revived me. I leapt onto the platform without thinking and held out my fare. "Piccadilly, please." He took it. I was going in the right direction. I was walking along Leicester Square when a picture title caught my eye, "Animal Farm." I went closer to look at the stills. They were of funny little animals with strong, ferocious expressions, and I began to be interested. As I looked across to the commissionaire, he announced, 5 shillings only." I glanced at the price list and asked him, "Won't there be any 3 and 6s?" "Couldn't say, miss. Well, at the start of the new programme there should be," he added and pointed. "Queue over there." I walked over to where there was the beginning of a queue on the pavement and pulled my coat around me. Casual conversations drifted to me, and I made an effort not to show the morbid interest I felt in them. The peculiar nagging envy I had felt before on studying the photograph album became strong again. The people directly behind me seemed to be students, 3 young men and a girl in an old fur coat. Their conversation was animated and humorous, and I felt insipid and half asleep beside them. I could almost see my yellowish-grey face turned flatly upon them. How odd they would think me, if they only noticed me. I stared down at my damp suede shoes, but a certain fascination made me look up again. The girl was laughing, running her fingers through her thin dark hair, revealing 2 excited eyes under her fringe, while the young men leaned forward and talked eagerly. "I don't like Reuben's women. They all have fat tummies," the girl was saying petulantly. "Now don't fib, Teddy. You hate them too." Teddy launched into a long speech, swaying backwards on his heels and accompanying it with extravagant gestures. Soon they all laughed delightedly again. I caught the girl's eye and looked away hurriedly, feeling like some frumpish old maid. I concentrated instead on a serious-faced schoolboy ahead of me who was busy polishing his thick glasses. 6 3 and 6s, the commissionaire rapped out. We hurried forward. Inside the small hop theatre, I found myself placed in the front row, with the students filling the seats to one side of me. The film absorbed me. The story progressed tragically to the death of the old horse, and I moved restlessly in my seat, unwilling to submit to the pathos of the scene. At once I was amazed to notice that the girl beside me was crying fiercely, huddled into her old fur coat. Even one of the young men had slithered as far down in his seat as possible to hide the wet patches on his cheeks. I went quite cold, as if I had suddenly noticed a danger lurking and forgot to swallow for a few seconds. Then a swift shame came over me. All these people were moved, and could I be lacking in something? It was an idea I was often to wonder about as time went on, though in my old country it would never have occurred to me. My lack had not stood out against anyone I had known there. In fact, I had always been regarded as rather emotional. In this world, I had come across something new. I began to be possessed by a longing to share in it. When I had accustomed myself to look at the colour red without being hurt by it, I had achieved part of something, but not all. I picked up the thread of the film and tried to surrender myself to the atmosphere. I even cheated a little and coaxed myself into a half yawn, which brought a few tears into my eyes. But the drollness of this struck me suddenly, and I could only grin silently down into my lap. The film was continuous, and as I had missed a little of the beginning, I remained seated when it began again. After a short time, I heard the students consulting about whether to sit through the whole film a second time. I bargained silently with them. "Stay, then I will too," and was relieved when they didn't move. The film had to end eventually, and emerging from the cinema, I found myself alone again. It was dark, so I turned hastily into the nearest Forte's cafe and perched at the bar with a hamburger. In this comfortable atmosphere of people eating and laughing together, I felt relaxed, and the confusion in my brain began to sort itself out. If this whole thing was a dream, I was taking a long time to wake up. Meanwhile, I would have to adjust myself to my surroundings. It shouldn't be too difficult, for they differed little outwardly from those I had been used to. There was this new colour, there was the slightly different accent, the more extreme climate. Later, I was to find several rather different customs. Thus simplified, it made the future look a lot clearer. Of course, there were the more complex problems of how I was to behave when back amongst friends and relatives who presumably knew me well. But at least I would have had time to work things out on my own. A cautious happiness began to invade me, and I felt a stirring of that adventurous spirit which my mother had attributed to an unconscious wish not to grow up. I thought of Mummy in the letter I had been reading that morning. I wondered about her a little. Then at last I forced myself out into the cold street again. There was a news seller by the Piccadilly Tube entrance, his back turned to me in a fawn duffel coat, though I had no name for it at the time. He turned as I approached to buy a magazine, and I tried to keep the horror out of my face. He had only one eye, and his cheek was drawn up into an agonizing twist, leaving his mouth a lipless hole in his torn face. I took my change hurriedly and hurtled down the steps into the tube station. At the bottom, I stopped and gazed for a moment, unseeingly, at a chocolate slot machine. I remembered the headlines in the newspaper I had in my pocket. A sense of danger and insecurity had replaced my spirit of adventure. That was the difference between our worlds, which I had failed to include in my summing up. This world was full of horrible, meaningless things. I thought how strange it was that people affected so strongly by the death of a horse in a film should allow or help such things to occur. Perhaps it was the very fact that their emotions were affected so easily which made them capable of those crimes I had read of. Of course, we had the occasional scandal in my old land. I could even remember a murder in my lifetime, but so much of it was incredible. Gradually, the slot machine drew into focus. I pulled myself together sharply and went to buy a ticket. It was crowded in the tube, and this time the warm roughness of coats rubbing against me didn't seem quite so friendly. My perceptive powers seemed to have sharpened, and all at once I noticed something about the people around me which I had missed before. Some of them were exaggeratedly thin, some terribly fat. Of course, there were the average ones as well, but here and there an extreme stood out, and these seemed to me sinister, even deformed. I didn't take long after this to get used to the fact, but at the time it made me shudder. I remembered a frightening dream I had once had, when things had swelled to abnormal proportions and then diminished sickeningly. My sense of insecurity grew. This was a world of extremes. Anything could happen, I thought, not for the first time. Anything. I almost ran up Sloane Street, with the cold air biting on my face, past the hotel, the telephone box, through the wooden doors, oddly church-like, down the dim hall and into my room. I had left the radio on, and this cheered me a little. Plugging in the small round heater, I noticed my hands were shaking. They were raw with cold, so I warmed them briefly, looking about me for familiar landmarks to calm my nerves. It was late, so I went to bed. I was more tired than I had thought. Just as I was dropping off to sleep, I woke with a start. My heart was beating wildly, and I couldn't quite decide what had happened. It was as if my mind had given a sudden squint and fixed in a twisted position for some seconds before it freed itself. I was going mad. The idea hit me with force, and for a moment everything reeled. Quite as suddenly, everything gained its balance again. Mad. What did the word mean, after all? I would probably be labelled by it if I tried to tell people of my strange experience of waking up out of another world. If I returned home and told my family of this new world, on the other hand, they too would suspect me of being insane. So what was the difference, whether I really was or not? With a brief hysterical laugh, I turned over and drifted into dreams, confused by the radio, which continued to play on the chair beside me.